I'm really excited to be joined by Mike Conover of Brightwave today. I'm not really sure I still understand what a token is or even how LLMs even operate. Certainly not enough to explain it to my 11-year-old son. So even after 18 months of studying these things, I'm a little dense with this stuff. I know how to do fundamental research, but that's about it. I'm really excited to have Mike Conover, who's the CEO and co-founder of Brightwave today, who not only understands what a token is, but he actually built an LLM from the ground up called Dolly at Databricks, and so is very, very deep into AI and LLMs and was deep before it got cool. One of the very common questions we get from our institutional investor analysts, PMs, and HR clients is, how should we use these tools? And one key question that always comes up is, are these tools simply a wrapper on ChatGPT, a wrapper on Grok, a wrapper on other open foundation models? And so really interesting to really dig in with Mike today on the pros and cons of using a foundation model, or like Brightwave has, building their own model. And so Mike will share his expertise with us, and thank you first of all for being on, Mike. Like in all of these webinars, my personal experience with LLMs is that sometimes it's a little bit abstract, that actually the workflow can be one of the key challenges to learning how to deploy these tools. So really the agenda for today is to start with a little use case. I've been exploring different areas of the institutional equity research process, how to apply deep research agentic AI. So I'm gonna share a very brief example on how I've been using LLMs to evaluate management. I'll then pass the mic to Mike, no pun intended, to really give us a deeper exploration of LLM technology and how that's applied to institutional equity research. And then, as always, we've gotten a lot of great Q&A, so I would encourage all of you to not be shy with your questions, many of which will be well above my head, but I'm guessing they're not above Mike's head on the technical side. A quick disclaimer, I'm going to use a few case studies in the illustration here on Starbucks and Harley Davidson. Not only is it not investment advice, I don't personally have a view either way on either of the ideas. So, our lawyers like the disclaimer here. Kind of just starting a little bit of framing. I kind of chuckle when I observe and pay attention to the AI narrative. Now, I heard one argument that LLMs today can do everything a fundamental equity research analyst does, and I'm kind of like, no, not even close. The view that AI will put stock pickers out of business in 2 or 3 years, that is part of the narrative now, to me is indicates a lack of understanding the nuance of the process. So a bit of what we'll try to do with our framing here is unpack what an institutional equity analyst actually does day to day, which is really our expertise. And to kind of make it a little fun, I asked Grok itself, are LLMs any good at picking stocks that outperform the market? Why or why not? So I'll reveal the answer to that question in 5 slides. We've been digging in a lot on LLMs, both kind of in our own research process and as part of the cutting edge webinar series. And there's obviously a lot that LLMs are great at doing. They're great at general summarization, great as a thought partner, really good with language. It's in the name, LLM, and very good at quantifying unstructured data. One of the really interesting use cases we found is identifying fraud and weakness in a systematic way. I've heard of investors using these tools to identify interesting molecules moving through the 3 phases of FDA approval. So there's a number of really interesting use cases emerging. There's a lot of attention on what AI still can't do, what LLMs can't do. And the basic one at the top is provide accurate data reliably. Can't financial model, which is really the chassis of the research process. Can't have conversations with management, sell side, other buy siders or channel checks. Although there was a high profile stock pitch competition a few weeks where a student team coded an LLM to call Smith & Wesson distributors to try and do some field research in an automated way, which was a really innovative approach. It can't integrate with truly valuable sources of underlying data easily due to the context window limitations, certainly the open source tools, and it really can't play the three-dimensional game of poker. What's baked into the market? What are the key drivers, and where am I different, and how my variant perception manifests in the stock price? A few kind of simple things, simple observations of what AI can't do is I saw on Twitter this post where someone asked just, hey, pull these numbers, revenue, net income, diluted numbers, and all the reds were the incorrect numbers. And so AI still can't perform simple tasks like pulling information. I was talking to my sons last night. My 9-year-old son asked me who's the biggest NBA rivalry, who's the biggest rivalry in the NBA now. One of the top 5 was the Mavericks versus the Phoenix Suns, indicating that Luka was still on the Mavericks. We all know he's moved on to the Lakers, and so it still can't pull relevant real-time information. And the Mavericks-Phoenix Suns rivalry, as a Phoenix Suns fans, might have been robust a few years ago, but if you followed the Suns, it's no longer robust. So it can't answer a simple question like this accurately. In the Harley Davidson exercise, it indicated that a former CEO of a competitor wouldn't be an interesting new CEO for Harley Davidson, given he was a former competitor. Which, if you've kind of studied turnarounds, it's obviously logically kind of the opposite. Opposite is true. And so asking Grok itself, can LLMs be a good stock picker? I think even AI doesn't think AI is good at stock selection. There's all sorts of interesting nuances about stock selection that make it less of a deterministic game than coding. Such as there's no right answer in stock selection. It's more thesis driven investing, few layups. The best investors are flipping 60-40 coins. And so it's a kind of more multi-dimensional game than some of the other simple use cases of AI. Fundamentally, stock selection isn't a game like poker. Coding. It's not even poker in the sense that fundamental investing is a game of hidden information and three-dimensional complexity. And ultimately, stock prices are determined by collective perceptions of future cash flows, right? Stock selection is a perception game in a way. Stocks move on expectations. There isn't a right answer. There's no information that can be uncovered that can give you a true and precise, accurate price on any given security. And so there's much more complexity. The institutional equity research process is a rigorous, structured process in many ways, but it's also a creative process where, yes, there might be a step-by-step process that an LLM could go through, but there's judgment around what matters here. What are the tailored analytics that I need to apply to the situation? Ultimately, what are the key drivers in making probabilistic bets on differentiation around those numbers? So we try to frame the institutional process as process and judgment, process of gathering information, developing expertise, and then ultimately making probabilistic bets on securities. There's very few situations in my career where I looked at a stock and said, this is a layup, this is an absolute, 100% no-brainer. Much more often is a situation where, this feels like a 60-40 coin flip, or maybe a 70-30 coin flip, where you're applying judgment to asymmetry, applying a little bit of intuition and feel based on the process insights. But back to the point that there's no kind of deterministic right answer. And so we've really been trying to dig into the different use cases of where an LLM may fit into the fundamental process, which we've done in this webinar series, such as idea generation or more language and transcript-based elements to pull insights from expert network transcripts, or to learn an industry, litigating episodic industry debates, filtering mechanisms to monitor your morning email, disconfirming evidence monitor, revisions anticipation monitor. We've dug into fraud and business quality, and today we want to dig into a little bit on management skill. And so that's really where we kind of fit into this, as playing our very, very tiny, insignificant part in the evolution of LLMs in fundamental research, is trying to figure out how to apply these tools in a way that can generate investor trust. There's very obviously an efficiency opportunity here. If you dial back the clock 70 years, back to 1952, fundamental stock pickers were using slide rules and value line and graph paper to identify interesting stocks. Fast forward 70 years, it's Excel, Bloomberg, Alt Data, Expert Network, sell-side resources, corporate access calendars, et cetera. People who observe, alpha pools might argue that not only is the evolution of tools not reduced analyst hours or number of analyst seats, it probably even hasn't eliminated fundamental alpha pools. The size of dollar alpha is probably larger than ever. Certainly, if you look at 22 to 24, the dollar alpha generated by a number of large multi-managers is at record levels. So the promise of efficiency is straightforward, whether that's generalist new idea generation, learning in industry, some kind of simple level one use cases, preparing for a management meeting, which we've outlined. The key risk being in all of these exercises is if you're outsourcing that connect the dots process by getting a 5-minute summary of the 10K instead of spending 90 minutes going through pen and highlighter, what is lost in that process? So that's a debate for another day. I call these like level one use cases of AI. Level two use cases to me are a bit more interesting because when deployed correctly, whether that's laterals and read-throughs or risk checklists or KPI yellow light monitor, these can actually go beyond the promise of efficiency and actually expand insight collection and generation, be true alpha signals. So that's where I've kind of been digging a little bit today. I've kind of come back to this framework of two types of exercises, a deterministic exercise where there's a fixed predictable outcome. We can all agree on the right answer, whether that's encoding an app or creating a PIV for investment bankers or running an accretion dilution analysis or summarizing an earnings call. There's kind of a right answer. In investing, the key debates tend to be these probabilistic exercises where there's uncertain outcomes. Two investors can look at the same fact pattern and come to different conclusions, whether that's understanding the impact of the new industry regulation or understanding if management can improve unit economics or whether consumer spending will sustain at high levels, how many boxes a new restaurant chain can have, whether a new CEO can drive a successful turnaround. And my hot take for you today is that the best use of LLMs today is not necessarily these deterministic processes, because this is where there are simply too mmany errors, certainly when it gets into anything quantifiable. If you go back to AI's inability to pull accurate data, but the more interesting use cases to me are these first cut exercises on these probabilistic exercises, where this takes a lot of research, a lot of artisanal research, a lot of reading, a lot of consideration, and as a first cut exercise in all of these questions can be a really valuable intellectual tool. Ultimately, stock pickers, fundamental investors have to make these probabilistic assertions on business quality and how margin structure will impact with the slowdown in revenues, whether a company will be acquired, can you sustain this level of price increases, will guidance be cut, what's happening competitively, how will what will happen to multiples if organic revenue growth accelerates, how will new drug launch. So these critical questions in stock selection are deterministic, not probabilistic. The easy level one use case, certainly will be figured out. But to me, the real alpha opportunity from deploying AI is in helping be an intellectual partner in these critical probabilistic considerations. I'll give a couple examples of connecting the dots. Is how might we've kind of seen this real time, how an assassination of a business leader led to less care management, which exacerbated a big earnings miss at United Health. I've used these tools to assess reimbursement risk for augmentative and alternative communication devices for autistic individuals, trying to understand what will be the warning signs to monitor around potential reimbursement risk. Today, I'll give a kind of a little example on when Starbucks hired Brian Niccol from Chipotle, stock pops 25%. How to assess in a first cut analysis whether that's overdone or more to come. Or if you're looking at Harley Davidson, which is a beaten down, secularly pressured business with a bad balance sheet, trying to understand whether the activist thesis there can be effective and whether the company can attract an A+ CEO and what that CEO could do with those underlying ingredients. So to dig into one of those probabilistic considerations, I wanted to give just a few quick slides on management. And the criticality of management is really kind of foundational to certainly the long-term, long-duration tiger-style investor, an activist investor. Jeff Ubben made the point that's fascinating how differently the same business can perform with two different leaders, which has been my experience as well. Lee, in a Value Investor Insight in 2006, said that Julian was maniacal on the importance of management. Always asking, "Have you done your work on management? Where'd the CFO go to college?" to tell an embarrassing story, for the first 18 months at Maverick, I always knew where the CFO went to college because I read this article of VII. Not once was I actually asked where the CFO went to college, but I guess I knew for that period of time. Long story short, investors, certainly longer duration investors, really believe intensely in the criticality of management. The hard part about evaluating managers, there's no right answer. If I want to go understand, hey, what are EBITDA margins in this business? That's a deterministic right answer. I can pull that from the income statements. I can pull that from my model. Considerations of what is a good CEO really are highly subjective. There's this concern about correlation or causation. Does a CEO look like a great CEO because there's been industry tailwind, or is it truly individual genius? So disaggregating luck and skill is hard. When Julian talked about doing your work on management, have you done your work on management? What does that entail? That can entail really an exhaustive 25, 30, 35 ongoing deep research process, evaluating track record and strategic vision and alignment and incentives, capital allocation, financial acumen, communication, market credibility, integrity, and red flag checklists. This can include evaluating, public filings, but also doing off-book references, talking to former peers and subordinates, et cetera, and really assessing and grading industry managers is a never-ending process. To give you a quick snippet of this from this really wonderful podcast that Patrick O'Shaughnessy did with one of the co-CIOs of Lone Pine. Kelly talked about her kind of traditional management evaluation approach, mentioning Starbucks and mentioning Ulta, really talking about meeting the new CEO of Ulta many years ago when she was a CMO at McDonald's, following that CEO for a long period of time, getting to know her, really developing that industry expertise to evaluate what a good manager and bad manager does and doesn't do. And so that artisanal management evaluation process is part and parcel of the core institutional research process. So my question is, how can we accelerate that? How can we do that in a more structured way with the use of these tools? Step one would be to gather the research raw ingredients, all the filings you need to do some of this work to evaluate historical performance. This is one of the barriers to some of the current tools. The context window is really limited in a ChatGPT and a Grok. Notebook LLM has a broader context window. But this is one of the use cases and a question we'll have for Mike in terms of integrating these underlying data streams into an open access tool. To dig a little bit deeper into Starbucks and Brian Niccol. Brian Niccol had great established credibility with investors. He had a track record of innovation and execution at Taco Bell, driving the Doritos Locos Taco innovation, other positive innovations, and really got Chipotle out of the ditch with food safety issues, accelerated the online business, and got the business really firing on all cylinders. And so when the announcement came in August of 2024, there was clearly an obvious skill set and need alignment. The stock popped 24.5% on announcement, which is $21 billion of market cap creation, or about 96 cents of implied earnings power improvement, holding the multiple. And this pattern recognition really led the influx of hedge fund buying, right? In the first 6 months out of the gate, you saw hedge funds like Viking and Lone Pine, Citadel and Balyasny come into the position. My hunch is that it's a bet on the underlying business quality of Starbucks, and more critically, the change agent nature of what Brian could bring to the case. And so to kind of take that artisanal manual process of how, if I was in seat evaluating Starbucks with Brian's presence, I really kind of broke it down into a 5-step process. One is diagnose the issue, what went wrong with the company. Try to understand, is this a broken brand? Is this a mature business? Or is this a fixable issue? Then I want to understand the executive a bit more. Is this the right person for the job? Is there a skill set alignment? And are the issues that have been happening at Starbucks fixable based on the skill set and the capabilities of the new executive? Then to think probabilistically, to understand the upside, downside, implied probabilities of success, and to then importantly monitor those turnaround milestones. So when should we expect improvement? What are the sorts of steps along the way that can give us a clue to when we're there? I won't go deeply into the prompt, but if you go to my Twitter, where I posted this yesterday, I posted in the replies the kind of full prompt architecture, if you'd like to grab it. And ultimately, my take on this process was that, with kind of O3 deep research, limited context window. So I put some of those documents into Notebook LM, but no documents were inputted into O3 deep research. I thought it was pretty darn good. Spit out a 20-page report, which again you can download off of the replies on that tweet. Super helpful as a first cut. Frame the issues really well, which allows me to kind of save that upfront investigation and framing time. Right, that might save me 5 or 10 or 15 hours of the process to start with this report to then understand, okay, is this compelling enough to deploy my valuable research hours? And where should I deploy those hours? What needs to be fixed? How fixable is it? What are the timelines and milestones? And try to understand whether the 25% move up in the stock has reflected the potential improvement of the business or not, right? Whether there's more to come or whether we've overshot this situation. And so there's a little bit of a paradox to me of LLM technology right now. Some of the very simple deterministic exercises like pull Q3 revenue for Google last year. LLMs still fail, fairly consistently in those sorts of exercises. But when we get down the rabbit hole in some of these higher value added use cases, I'm actually, pretty impressed, candidly pretty blown away by the caliber of some of the research that is being generated from these tools, almost to the point where I can say if you aren't using these tools, you should be, that you're kind of, they can be really deployed now today as really helpful elements in your research process. I'll give you another one. The nice part about creating these prompts is it's scalable. I can take that same prompt and I can then put that same prompt into Harley Davidson. I saw a few weeks ago or last week that there's a major shareholder board shakeup with an activist investor in Harley Davidson. So I thought to myself, hey, let's deploy this to Harley and see what could happen in the activist campaign. And what you see in Harley is it's a cheap stock at 5 times earnings. Now it's cheap because it has a lot of leverage, 10 points off prior peak margins. So EBITDA margins got from 26 to 16. So clearly an opportunity for the right CEO with the opportunity to come and raise margins. An interesting tariff prior that can be pulled up from LLM. In 83, Reagan put tariffs on Japanese motorcycles, and that was contributed to the turnaround. So clearly not trying to make an investment recommendation here. But these are the sort of the use cases that I'm finding really interesting to say, okay, who might be the winners and losers from tariffs if implemented, and certainly the kind of the made in America manufacturers where you're manufacturing Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, losing share to foreign competitors if they're tariffed. That could obviously lead to a market share turnaround if other elements of the brand and innovation cycle are brought back on board with a new and right CEO. So just a very simple case where I might have spent 12 hours reading to try and understand some of these cases on Harley Davidson. I may or may not want to deploy my research time, but as an upfront idea generation tool to be able to deploy these research prompts into potential turnarounds, new CEO stories, I find to be a pretty valuable use case of research. With that, I will stop talking and I will hand over the mic to the true star of the show today, Mike, who also has a deck. I will make you co-host, Mike, so you can share your screen. Feel free to poke any holes. I love criticism on anything we said because we're on a quest to learn how to deploy these tools. So any advice, frameworks you can give us collectively as analysts working to deploy these tools, and we'll hand it over to you. So thanks so much for being with us, Mike.
Oh goodness, it's a pleasure, man. Thanks for having me. It's good to see you again. And yeah, very thoughtful stuff there. I will say the points about what the language models can't do are so well taken. I think the idea that a language model is going to be a drop-in replacement for any human work worth doing is pretty clearly not the case. Instead, I think what you're seeing is language models as an accelerant and deploying the technology against workflows where I'll talk a little bit about this, but it calls into question whether the task of reading and collating is a good use of human time and intellect, as opposed to understanding, having a conversation with management at a conference and really connecting the dots across interactions and doing that, probing human work, those channel checks with management in the field, understanding is this material, is this not, those kind of qualitative judgments. It's just not something an AI system is ever going to do. I'll pull up this deck here. We see a lot of this similar themes when it comes to the kinds of applications for this technology, whether it's bespoke initiating coverage, you're stepping into a new name, want to get up to speed really quickly, understand what's material to this stock. Investors that have large books of coverage, it's earnings season, I need to understand how my thesis is impacted. Breaking news, for example, we see these tariffs coming online. Within my existing portfolio, what is the impact of this development? And really, I think where you start to see some of the differences with consumer grade language models is that comprehensiveness. I think you mentioned context window limits and the ability to for these systems to see thousands and thousands of pages of material simultaneously. There are compromises that you make when you build a consumer grade system that needs to serve 500 million people globally, that are not appropriate for the investing use case. The comparable that we look to is, with respect to how this technology will change the work, is finance professionals and accountants in the 70s. So you use that slide rule analogy. You talk to an accountant in 1978, you say, what's your job? That person is going to say, well, I run the numbers. I write it out by hand on a long form spreadsheet, and it is time intensive. It's cognitively demanding. It's important to the business. And goodness, nobody wants that job anymore. It's not anything anybody's trying to do. And it's not because they're not finance professionals or accountants. It's because the sophistication of the analysis that can be brought to bear on any given problem is so increased. The leverage is maximized by the existence of computational spreadsheets. And we see a similar sea change with respect to some of the reasoning and reading and collating and synthesizing processes that historically human analysts have been engaged in. And the thing that changes now is not that a language model is going to tell you which investments to put on, or is going to ultimately be the system that understands how your portfolio is impacted by a particular change, or whether whether the tone and voice of management on a call is, are they running scared? This is not something that AI is ever going to displace, but the ability to give you an index into the space of information, say, this is what's material, this is what's bubbling up across thousands of pages of SEC filings, earnings call transcripts, investor presentations. Systems like Brightwave are able to read through bodies of text that exceed the limits of humans' ability to keep everything in mind all at once. And particularly when it comes to autonomous processes, and we have built an agentic system at Brightwave that is able to mimic the decision-making process of a human analyst, to condense hours and hours of work into a matter of minutes. And that is the promise of systems that not only in the ChatGPT, contrast with ChatGPT, where you ask a question, you get a response, it streams in. The future of AI systems are systems that are making decisions and assessing their intermediate work products to say, is this relevant? Does this connect with the original instruction I was given? How should I understand this? What other information should I consider? They critique and refine their own work products in order to get a high quality output. And so I'd like to spend, ahead of a demo of the platform, a little bit of time talking about what we're seeing in the market. And so for a bit of background on myself, I'm the CEO and co-founder of Brightwave. I've been building language models for many years at this point. I created Databricks' first language model. I've been building AI/ML systems for more than 15 years. And we're going to talk a little bit about some of the technical considerations that go into building systems like this, because I think they inform how you select what is the right tool for the job. So one of the things that is true about language models. So Brett used that's a great way to say it. You know, I still don't know what a token is. Language models are trained to predict the next word in a sentence effectively, and they consume effectively the totality of human-generated text and develop a rich internal representation of the world and semantic concepts within that body of text. And as the techniques get more and more sophisticated, the quality of the output and the likeness to what it is seen on the internet and all books that have ever been written increases. But one of the things that is still true in 2025 is that for anybody in the audience who uses language models regularly, I think one thing you'll notice is that the most interesting interactions you frequently have with a language model are far into the branching path of a conversation. You ask a question, the language model responds. You ask a follow-up question or refine. You say, that's not quite right. I want something else. And it's 6 or 8 turns into the conversation among all the possible different responses you could have, or the language model might have, that you start to get really, really powerful behaviors. And what is happening computationally is that you can think of a language model and the weights of a neural network as defining a set of programs. And you are steering the language model into a certain behavior in that interactive process, and saying, I want the neural network to have a certain set of activations so that it can solve the problem at hand. And that's, Brett, why you had to write such a long prompt. I saw that tweet. That was a page of text. And the reality is that prompting is hard. It is, goodness, I have talked to a lot of really, really sharp investors who struggled to know what to say to a language model in order to get it to elicit the behavior that's desired. And whether it's the blank page problem or this long litany of tips and tricks, and the fact that you need to specify what is the desired format of the output, that is just a fact about using this technology, is that understanding what to say is difficult, especially for non-subject matter experts. And so what we've built at Brightwave is a system that takes a lot of that work off of your plate by mimicking the human decision-making process. And so instead of having to understand not only how to construct that large initial prompt, but then what kinds of follow-up questions and hallucination mitigation techniques are necessary to get high-quality work outputs, Brightwave is able to decompose that task into a sequence of autonomous decisions where the knowledge agent is given a research instruction. It will decompose it into multiple different considerations. So if you, for example, want to understand how Tesla is impacted by tariffs relating to, or like China's export controls on certain kinds of magnets, there are many different factors that you would want to consider in order to really understand, is Tesla differentially impacted by this development? Understanding what are the subqueries that are related to the original research intention, routing that to the appropriate data source, understanding which documents are relevant to this research instruction, then reading each of those documents front to back with a language model. So this is similar to what the best human analyst is going to do. Is you're not searching and sort of creating a collage. One of the ways to deal with these context window problems is to take little snippets of documents, and that's where some of those errors start to creep in when you just basically, it's like a ransom note. You cut the document into a lot of little pieces and recompose it, and something is lost in the process. With Brightwave, we use a language model to read every page of every document front to back. And we say, here's evidence that is relevant to that initial research intent. And then we enrich it. We say, well, what might this mean? how should we understand the implications of this with respect to my original question, and engage in error correction, and ultimately distill down very large collections of findings over bodies of content that exceed both what fits in even million token context windows, but absolutely exceeds the limits of what a human can keep in mind simultaneously. And we then weave that together through a process called synthesis into these high quality research reports. And all of these different steps are small decisions where the behavior of the system in the aggregate is substantially impacted by the decisions that are made at each of the individual local, like at the local level. And so your ability to get high quality research output from a language model system is a direct reflection of how thoughtfully the algorithm underpinning those systems are designed. And so what I'd like to show with Brightwave is our vision for the future of investment research. And it's not a chat interface. We think that chat is an incredibly powerful tool for fact finding, for question answering. But that the way that humans will interact with language models and the way that investors will interact with language models in the future is a data product experience. And that's what we've built with Brightwave. So I'm going to show the platform here. We've got a bunch of different projects. I'm going to step into a few. I'll start with an analysis. You mentioned that briefly you mentioned understanding drug discovery and sort of how molecules are progressing through clinical trials. So one of the ways that you can use Brightwave is to extract structured data from unstructured content. And so if I want to understand, for example, the results that Eli Lilly is reporting with respect to tirzepatide, I can define across all of Eli Lilly's earnings calls, SEC filings, investor presentations, conference appearances, analyses, and extract with respect to any of these factors. Is this coming up on this call? What is it, if I want to understand the results from the Summit clinical trials, I can scrub each of these calls and read them front to back with a language model and distill down what is being disclosed in the context of this specific clinical trial, or tirzepatide headwinds, right? Are they having production capacity issues? And really start to accelerate that time to insight by understanding where the material facts are within bodies of content that exceed the limits of a person's ability to keep it all in mind simultaneously. Similarly, I might look at a company like Rivian, and I would say, well, to help me understand, what are they meeting their production targets? What is leading to an inability to meet production targets? And I can click in and say, well, it turns out it's supply chain disruptions. They're shutting down the factory line, and really, at a glance, have a very focused view on a single name or set of names. Now, the way that starts to get, if we step into an analysis of many, many different companies with respect to, economic headwinds in China, or the impact of new U.S. tariffs, we really start to reach the limit of your ability to read individual analyses of those documents. And so what we've built with our report generation capability is a powerful system for defining what are the factors that I care about, and producing high quality long form analysis that has sentence level attribution to the underlying primary source. So with respect to that, your sort of case study, Brett, on Starbucks, we can define in Brightwave different factors that would be relevant to my consideration of the sort of management timeline and management quality at Starbucks, for example. And what Brightwave is going to do for any of these sections in this report, whether it's, what is Brian Nichols' strategic vision? What have analysts been asking on the calls? What are the key questions that I should ask with respect, if I have a sit down with management, what do I want to get into? Help me, be that partner in thought for me, and help me understand on the basis of all of the, sell side analysis, public we've included sell side analysis in here, public filings, all that information. What should I dig into? I'm able to define these analyses and then in Brightwave produce this high quality, long form, deep research output. These findings have sentence level attribution to the underlying primary source. I'm able to understand where this information is coming from. I can highlight any passage and say, tell me more about this. And this is one of the places where a system like Brightwave, it is not a replacement for human judgment. It is the starting point for your decision-making process. And I can say, well, that fact is interesting to me. I want to know more about it. And what Brightwave is going to do is it's like a magnifying glass for text. It's going to let you drill into more granular detail with respect to the most eye-catching findings. And what's really interesting here is the ability to save this as a blueprint. So if I have an analysis of if I say, listen, I like this set of questions to get up to speed on management for a company, I can say, I'm going to say this is a management primer. I can now step into a new company. I can say, well, I want to look at Rivian, for example. I say, well, let's pull in data from Rivian, and I'm going to generate a report, and I'm going to use that management primer as that template. And that blueprint is going to initiate that agentic deep research process. So you're going to have the ability to apply that house view, those best practices to any name and get that, one important way that this kind of research output is different from what you're going to get from a ChatGPT is the ability to steer the direction of the analysis and say, these are the factors that really matter to me. Like O3 is fantastic, particularly when you're for public web search. But it's any color you want as long as it's 20 pages of text. Whereas with a system like Brightwave, you're able to really crisply define these are the factors that matter in this report. This is how I want it structured. And then when something catches your eye, you're able to drill in and get details on demand. And that work surface is much more comprehensive than you're going to get from a chat-based UI. And the underlying algorithm is really going to turn over every page of every document to ensure that no stone goes unturned. And so I'll pause there. I'd love to answer any questions from the audience. Happy to continue the conversation, Brett.
Yeah, you made that was really, really interesting. Mike, you made a comment that the large foundational models have to make compromises to serve 500 million individuals. What do you think are the most relevant compromises that they're making in the context of fundamental research?
Well, so at the heart of the matter is it's search. You have a large body of documents. What they're doing is that they're breaking them up into roughly paragraphs and then saying, I want to find paragraphs that are, you would call it semantically similar. So if I say, goodness, Tim Cook is engaged in talks to by Meta. You're going to find passages that, if you just search over the SEC filings, you're going to find passages that mention Apple, that mention Tim Cook, that mention Meta. Those things are not necessarily relevant to the question at hand, but they are semantically similar. And so what you're doing is you're kind of taking a piecemeal approach to what information am I considering. That's something that'll, that's very fast. It's very efficient from a computationally efficient. But it's not necessarily a great approach if you need to make sure that you have all of the relevant information. And so what we do at Brightwave is we use a language model to read every document front to back every time. And so you really get that high quality reasoning to ensure that the comprehensiveness that's required for this problem space is there.
Right. Right. Yeah, that makes sense. And what goes into building your own model? I mean, it's, I think as just an observer
Mhm.
of this space, seeing the, 10, 15, $20 billion of CapEx being spent on the foundational models as a user of these open access tools, seeing the pace of improvement from GPT 3.5 to O3 has
Yep.
been pretty robust. In this context, how do you compete with that sort of CapEx wave? Maybe it's more purpose building. But what does it entail to build your own LLM for this use case?
Yeah, and I'll just to be real clear, we use a combination of proprietary and commercial models. So
Okay.
I think they say foundation models are the fastest depreciating asset of all time. I think that is a true statement. Um, you want to choose the right tool for the job, and so we train models for if you think about that compute graph and the different subsystems that um, you bring online to get really, really high quality outputs from a research process like this. Uh, there are commercial models that are great at some things. There are sub problems where only the specifics of our problem domain really matter. And so training a bespoke model makes a lot of sense. Now, your point about CapEx, I think that it turned, with Databricks and Dolly, we trained a model for $30 in 30 minutes. That was one of the big findings is that you can elicit instruction following behavior from open source technology much more easily than was previously understood. And I would say that particularly with open source foundation models like DeepSeek and its peers, we're seeing that the amount of capital required to get really, really high quality uh, models is less than previously thought. So it is again about choosing the right tool for the job, and that's where I've been doing this for 15 years. My co-founder, former CTO of a federally regulated derivatives exchange and clearinghouse, his first deep learning patent was filed in 2018. We've just got 9 feet of options behind when the off-the-shelf stuff doesn't work.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That makes sense. That makes sense. And trust is a big thing. I mean, it's fun to be on Twitter because you get all sorts of stories and replies and about examples of hallucinations and fabrications. And there was this article in TechCrunch last week that stated that O3 and O4 from ChatGPT are actually getting worse on hallucinations than prior models. Why is that? And how do you defend against that? And how do investors develop trust
Yeah.
to use these tools? We're not building marketing copy for a lemonade stand where hallucinations are fine. Like,
Yeah.
really, we're dealing with mission critical information, deploying, our dear, allocator capital of which we have a fiduciary duty, and hallucinations can really be career ending if they're not caught in certain contexts.
So a couple of thoughts on this. One, uh, I saw that take that on this benchmark O3 is performing worse. That may be a statistical blip, I believe, and the long view on the benchmarks supports the view that hallucination rates are decreasing by orders of magnitude, and I believe that that trend will continue.
Okay.
Um, so that's one. There are additionally techniques that concrete example, you can ask a language model to self-correct, and that improves fidelity downstream. You can generate a response, and then in the uh, next instruction say, "Are you sure?" And this is the kind of prompting stuff that you probably know about, but it's like, goodness, this is not a good use of anybody's time to have to do this. And so you can automate that process. And so there are techniques for reducing uh, hallucination rates with respect to the frontier models. Those are also changing over time. The real answer to the question is product affordances that allow you to see the primary source and ask clarifying questions so that you can corroborate surprising findings from multiple different perspectives. And ultimately, if you can't, it has to be a flexible interface that allows you to ask those follow-up questions. And if something is surprising, um, understand it from multiple different perspectives. And at the same time, I would say like um, you can't wash your hands of responsibility for the primary. So this is like somebody who works for you, who, at this point, it's still that associate level talent. And you can't just say, I'm sure it's fine, ship it. The last thing I'll say is like use language models for the things that they're great at. Your point about like financial modeling is really well made. Like if you've got this is kind of a private markets use case, but if you've got a customer cube, or a list of customers, like goodness, Excel is great for getting the top five. Like, you don't need to use a GPU to do that. And so I think it's about, to your point about workflow, understanding where these things are great, and understanding where other tools are more appropriate, and then striking the right balance. And that's why we see the most sophisticated investors getting off the sidelines early and not letting these kinds of issues, which you can't be dismissive of, like the correctness is like non-negotiable on a certain level. But if you wait 2 years until the hallucination rates are 6 nines, you're going to be so far behind the curve in terms of how do we actually integrate this at our business.
Yeah.
And so that openness to experimentation, I think, is really important.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. And you mentioned the blank page problem, which I think is like a real problem for us with, as analysts, PMs, there's so much news flow. We're dealing with our processes that have been honed over time. And to sit there in a context window and try and figure out what to put into that prompting challenge. What is your experience dealing with clients of how they're kind of solving that? What are the top 5 or 10% of kind of thought leaders in the investment industry doing on prompting? Even for me, kind of that's like I had to sit and think for a couple
A
hours,
lot of work.
use
It's
LLMs to create the prompts and then run them back and then fix them. And it's like, damn, if I'm actually managing capital, I don't know if I have the time to do that.
man, it has been interesting to see how many smart people who absolutely from a like just cognitive horsepower could understand just the opportunity cost is too high. And so they just listen, I got 8 words for you, maybe 10. And that's the problem. And so I think your point about using language models to enhance prompts is where that's going, right? I want a trust and verify approach to prompting where I can say, I want to initiate in coverage of this company, and it's going to say, well, here are the 15 factors that I think would be relevant. And with a single click, I can say, well, dismiss that one. I like this one, but maybe a slightly different perspective on it. And now you're collaborating with the machine to get to something that reflects your view, but you don't have to type it all in. And there's a bunch of stuff that I saw in your prompt, like the formatting instructions. It's just like that. Nobody should ever have to say that. Nobody should ever have to type that into a computer.
Yeah, yeah. So you're saying that in the UI, you can just click in the certain areas and then your system will
It
give all
enhances it.
those
Yeah,
instructions.
exactly. Exactly. If I'm looking at tariffs, like what are all of the other considerations? And not all that has to be exposed to the end user, right? You want to be able to see what did it consider, but I don't necessarily need to sign off on all of this. It should be intelligent enough to make some of these decisions on its own.
Yeah. Yeah, the vision of a hedge fund PM typing "Are you sure?" over and over into
It's
a
not going to happen. It's not also not a world I want to inhabit.
Are you sure? uh, that's great. Interesting. I think Brightwave deals with both public market and private market clients. My sense in general is that LLMs have received more adoption in private market investors and investment bankers where there's more information. There's information in a data room. It's kind of a more linear process to compile information, and there hasn't necessarily been as much adoption yet in public market contexts. I'm not sure exactly why that is. I have hunches and kind of thoughts on that, but I'd be curious kind of what you're seeing in your
Yeah.
observations and where the industry adoption cycle is.
So we have seen brisk demand across financial services, but what I will say is that um, one factor is that the private market data rooms are extremely alpha generating. You've just got documents that nobody else has ever looked at. And I think we talked about language models being trained on, uh, in a way, they generate consensus outputs, right? Is like, what is the most likely next token? Is very similar to like, what would the market think? And that can be useful for, to your point, like thought partnership, idea generation, certainly scrubbing to get to the information. I need an overview of Brian Nichols and the management timeline at Starbucks. I actually don't need you to do any creative thinking there. I think in the public markets, it is such a knife fight in a phone booth over alpha that if you're thinking about the SEC filings, it's like these models. There are a lot of humans who are also doing the work, and so I think it's just easier to generate alpha in private market contexts.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That makes sense. Are you? I mean, without kind of being too specific, like what do you think the leading public market investors are doing? Like how are they deploying
Oh, sure.
these tools today? Like what are the interesting use cases or
Yeah, I mean, there it is always. It depends, but I think listen, I've got, I think the applicability, especially to long only books, is really clear where it's just like, I've just got a lot of names that I need to understand.
yeah.
And, I need to understand across 80 different companies, what are the impacts of this development, or it's just earnings season. I need to run the same analysis on many, many names. Um, we see, there's always a build versus buy decision. I think the largest, most sophisticated institutions have internal teams that can do work that looks like this. It turns out that building um, what is the product experience? That's a really hard design problem. No,
Mm.
like we believe that chat is not the final form factor for this stuff. It's also probably the case that what we have today is not the final form factor at Brightwave. And what we see is a lot of teams who are building out really, really specific point solutions where it's like, okay, we've got this corpus that is so proprietary. We're just not comfortable sending it over the wire to anybody. Or we've got this specific technique that no commercial vendor is going to replicate at scale, but that they are looking to uh, looking to us to do some of that bread and butter work where it's like, I just need to read through this factor across all these names, or I need to get to a tear sheet or an earnings preview, repeatedly for all my analysts. And so I think the build versus buy stuff is really like, what is it that only we can do? And that's where we see them focusing.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Um, all right, I have exhausted most of my question lists. Other questions may pop into my head as we go along. We have two in the Q&A, but I again would encourage you at this moment to drop any questions into the Q&A, and I will relay them on to Mike. We're starting, Mike, with the ultimate softball from Michelle. What was your initial driver to create Brightwave? Thanks. We did not plant that one, so let's hear the genesis story of your
Yeah,
entrepreneur
sure.
growth.
I think it is it's been answered. I saw it disappear. Um, so my work has always been concerned, whether it's my PhD research or any of the work that I've done subsequently, but concerned with how we can use very large scale data sets to understand human decision making and behavior. And the markets are the ultimate manifestation of that process. And historically, and I've worked in places. When I was at LinkedIn, we published a Nature paper, so one of the Nature Communications, one of the top scientific journals in the world, where we showed that 500 million job transitions on LinkedIn could, global scale, planet scale job transition network could predict next quarter changes in S&P 500 market caps. It could have been a semi-systematic signal. LinkedIn did not trade on that data, and so we published a paper about it. It took more than a year and a big team of people to build that out. And what the promise of language models is that you can now distill down signal from very, very large scale corpuses in a way that has just historically been impossible. You had to field teams of PhD researchers and hundreds of millions of dollars, and now you can build systems that do the kinds of things that would have been a year-long initiative at a consumer internet company. You can do it very, very effectively with this new class of technology. And so it just, a long-standing interest of mine in the markets and human decision-making processes met sort of a generational technology.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I find that to be true even on a micro level to understanding priors. I mean, a big part of what we do in public market research is understand, have we seen this story before?
Mm-hmm.
So going back to Grok pulled up the 83 Japanese tariff on motorcycles as a relevant prior for thinking about Harley Davidson in 2025. I'm like, that's pretty good. I could include that if I were to construct a thesis on Harley. Like, that's pretty impressive research that I don't know from an artisanal manual process how I would have come to that insight. So yeah, I think that's I'm with you on that kind of the directional value of saving lots of manual research time is interesting. Um, all right. Question from Anonymous. Does Brightwave use vector-based RAG to identify the relevant parts of the relevant documents for a given task?
I mean, I will be somewhat opaque because the details do matter a lot here, but we use a language model and not a vector embedding to read every page of every document to understand what's relevant.
What is a vector-based RAG? Can we
Yeah,
just define terms?
this is kind of vectoring at some or vectoring. This is kind of like directed at some IP questions, and so like I'm just gonna be a little circumspect, but I'll describe what a vector index is and why it's a bad solution for this problem. So if you imagine, let's talk about medicine and animals, okay? And I want to locate a document with respect to that two-dimensional axis. I can count the number of times the word medicine and the number of times the word animals appears in the document. And I can put it in an XY coordinate, right? And so documents about, from PubMed are going to be over here, have a lot of medicine, word medicine occurs frequently and the word animals does not. Documents about cats on the internet are going to be located over here. And documents about veterinary science are going to have large magnitude in both dimensions, both XY axes. Play that out at the scale of hundreds or thousands of dimensions, and where the dimensions are not single words, but instead semantic concepts like, consumer goodsness or, related party transaction risk. And what you can do is you can, through this process known as embedding, locate a document in a high dimensional vector space. And then what these models do is they take a query like that, any question you would have for a language model, and it will say, where is this query with respect to the documents that I've embedded? And what these models are limited in the sense that they only capture the semantic similarity of the question and answer pairs, or the question and passage pairs. And so their ability to actually understand nuance is very low. What also happens in that process, this sort of vector-based RAG process, is that you cannot embed an entire document because there are many different sets. I mean, you can, but you lose a lot of detail. And so what you wind up doing is chunking the documents into paragraphs or pages. And it becomes this kind of collage process where you take just one page from this 10K and then, the first page, the 25th page, and the 30th page, the 300th page from a long industry research report, and kind of smash those together. And a language model is very credulous. It will try to give you an answer regardless of how relevant the primary sources are. And a lot of to your point about hallucination, a lot of where the error creeps in is that kind of lossy, semantically similar collage does not lead to really, really high quality research outputs. And it's what you would do if you needed to serve, like a Perplexity, for example, many consumer grade demand. where it's, we're shooting for, a non-trivial fraction of the entire human population. Not necessarily, those technologies are not necessarily appropriate for investors. And so we use more expensive, more compute intensive techniques that give us much higher fidelity outputs.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Okay. Question from Andrew Carr. How much of what you see in client usage of Brightwave for public markets is employed in ramping on a new name versus maintaining coverage on a large list of names?
I think it's a good mix. So the ramping coverage use case is infrequent. And so a lot of what we see is like around events. Like, hey, this has happened. We've got suddenly these China has export controls on rare earth metals. What's the impact across my portfolio? So I would say it's actually less of the initiating coverage use case. So that is super high valuable, but it's just less frequent.
Gotcha. All right, we have time for a few other questions. If there are any others, one just came in. Can Brightwave ingest broker research to become part of the corpus of information to fulfill a task?
Yeah. So earnings call transcripts, broker research, we use very powerful computer vision models to understand the contents of very, very diverse data sources.
Yeah. Why do you think it's been maybe this is part of your point that these foundation models have become purpose-built for all use cases, but the context window of many of the open source tools is really small. Like I think you can only upload 5 or 10 PDFs into Chat GPT, Notebook LM. You can upload
Yeah,
a bunch, but like
I mean,
why is that? Seems like that's
it's the
very annoying to me trying to drop in a bunch of earnings transcripts or 10K.
Well, not for nothing, it's a pain in the butt to have to download a PDF and then upload it into it,
Yes. Yeah.
right? Yeah. So like that's that workflow stuff also. Um, it's the need to serve consumer grade scale. Like you can't give 500 million people the ability to upload hundreds of documents for every prompt. What's more, they're just if you're streaming responses back, so agentic processes, like obviously and what I mean by streaming is you ask a question, it starts replying immediately. What we are seeing with reasoning models is known as test time compute, where you spend additional time thinking through how should I approach this question. And that's what Brightwave does under the hood is it invests compute in order to get a higher quality output. And so there are just some limits on what you can serve at consumer scale. Um, and I think that makes a lot of these tools like showy, like it's a neat demo, but then when you try to use it, it is you start to see the rough edges pretty quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's why I was kind of cheating with Starbucks a bit too, because there's so much information in the public realm on Brian Nickel and Starbucks. But if you go to some more obscure $750 million industrials, small cap without that information, I mean, what's impressive about the Starbucks '03 document is it's sitting on no direct SEC filings or earnings transcripts or broker research or let alone internal notes or research. And so that's like almost step one of the challenge is how to ingest all of that information into the reasoning
Yep.
model, which would it seems to be an argument for these tools like a Brightwave and a number of others where you built that workflow in.
Well, I mean, man, O3 is super impressive. It will be interesting to see what happens to public internet search. And I think your point about um, just the diversity of information that it's able to pull in is really well made. You know, I mean, we talked to a lot of investors who are using deep research from OpenAI uh, because it's great at understanding what's on the public internet. One of the sort of considerations that you have to make is like what is the corpus? So I use O3 for trip planning, for example. I'm like looking, I'm thinking of Upper Peninsula in Michigan. Let's see what that looks like. Fantastic. But I don't know that you want Investopedia in the mix when it comes to understanding a name. It's just like there's some tastes there. And so having a little more, having affordances that allow you to control like what is relevant here. Those are just tools that are specific to this vertical that do not necessarily make their way into some of the more like chat oriented interfaces.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Even the Starbucks report pulled the analytics from a Morningstar report, and no shade on Morningstar, but it's not
Sure.
Goldman Sachs or it's not
And
a hedge fund sort of
you want
quantitative
as possible. Yeah.
analysis. And if in the view the stock selection adheres to power law dynamics that the top 5% of investors generating 50% plus of the alpha, a big giant web scrape of blogs and Wikipedia and
Yeah.
books is not necessarily the recipe for outperforming markets.
Yeah, and I just want to be like for your audience, like, there are a ton of applications for public internet search. And I think somebody's going to win that market and it's going to change how we interact with the internet. I think there is a huge swath of the problem space within investment research that does not have to do with that capability set. And that's really where we're focused.
Right, right. Another one from Michelle. Is it arguable you still need to know what you're looking for your answer in order to derive your info from the LLM?
That's where the agentic workflows are so powerful is the ability to inspect the documents and understand what is contained within here and what other questions might I ask? And say these are the analyses that you should consider based on what I know so far. And then you can say that one, that's a good idea. We don't need to run that down. And the answer is no. These systems are able to, Brightwave is able to inspect the documents and then say, what else would I want to know in order to uh, firm up my understanding of this subject?
Yeah. Okay. Um, does Brightwave have any technical analysis research capabilities that are enhanced by LLMs?
That's not an area that we focused.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about quantitative investors? Are quants using LLMs at
I,
all, or it seems like the standard quant tools are still kind of not necessarily enhance a lot, maybe small things like NLP, et cetera.
yeah, for a lot of the reasons that you've identified. I think some of the concerns that maybe a year ago were really relevant about mathematical capabilities, like we're seeing international math Olympiad level performance from some of the frontier models. But just the ergonomics of doing modeling using a language model are awkward. You're waiting for a table to stream in. And that's like, Excel is fantastic if you want to see how something is calculated. And so I think it's just like right tool for the job. We've picked a lane, and we're laser focused on it.
Yeah, makes sense. All right. Well,
Pleasure.
we will end with a fun closing question of, take out your crystal ball 18 to 36 months down the road. What are your hot takes or vision of the future as it relates to fundamental analysis and LLMs? Where do you think we're at? Any surprises?
Yeah.
What does the world look like, a couple of years down the road?
I think we see systems that are much more capable with respect to long running autonomous research. I think we're kind of in that 5 to 10 minute range right now for like outputs. And some of that is just how effectively can these systems plan a sequence of actions and then self-supervise. Um, we see this in software engineering also. We write a lot of code using AI tools. This is one of the reasons that I believe this is going to impact just about every economically productive activity. Is that software engineering is like the details matter. Like you can have a single character that is wrong and the whole thing falls apart. We are using these tools extremely productively. And what you're seeing is that I'm going to dispatch a task and it's going to come back in 3 or 5 minutes with code changes that I then review. And I think we're peeking over the cusp of not just like I ask a question, I get an answer. I ask another question, I get another answer. But instead, I'm going to dispatch work to this thing, and it's going to come back with that trip plan for that Upper Peninsula 7-day itinerary, or any other activity, I think we as a population are getting much more comfortable with dispatching work to systems that then report back once they have completed the task. And um, I think that'll be a very interesting future to inhabit when you are seeing that idea generation process get amplified and amplified and yeah, the future is quite bright.
That's super interesting too, because that solves the blank page problem in a way that if you
Oh,
create
howdy.
these systems that are alerting systems or
Yeah.
pull rather than
And you
push.
see to your point, like about pattern recognition. Oh, this is interesting. This is relevant to the name that I knew to ask about. What other names should I consider? Who else has exposure? And then I see, oh, that company depends on this glass supplier. That's interesting. This is on the critical path for all of these people. Like the ability of a system to pull the thread. When I said like I've spent my life building systems that can see more than a human is able to understand, but it's been very technically, it's taken teams of people. I think we soon inhabit a future where you can just dispatch an agent that will run down analysis for you and then come back with real surprising findings.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, we'll save this tape. We'll reconnect in
Yeah,
8
yeah.
on the cutting
It's a
edge.
time
We'll,
stamp it on Twitter, man.
we'll see. We'll see where we're at. So Michelle said really great info. Thank you for the presentation and discussion. And I will echo that. This was great. Really
Great.
interesting stuff. Maybe someday I'll understand what a token is. But it was helpful.
Hopefully you'll never have to. That's the 36-month projection. Is it won't matter to all the users. It's just the technology works.
Right, right. All right. Well, thank you so much, Mike, and thanks everyone for the participation and great questions. Thanks.